this. And as I mentioned, there are people who kept all of this alive for you. And today we have a very special Lifetime Achievement Award to two very special recipients. And I think if we would roll the video.
Daniel Greene was born in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1934 to Earl and Gertrude Greene, who had settled there after immigrating from Poland, Russia, and Eastern Europe at the turn of the century. Daniel began showing his natural talent for art quite early in life, even though his school didn't offer art classes until the 4th grade. At 13, he attended the children's classes at the Art Academy of Cincinnati, his first formal training. By 1952, Daniel was a senior in high school. In his haste to study art, he decided to quit school and move to Miami Beach. There, he discovered portrait sketch artists catering to tourists. He joined the crowds watching the pastel artists, who were primarily Cuban. When Daniel applied for a job sketching at one of the shops, called Winkos and Serge, he was told there were no openings. He reapplied later, and this time was told the bitter truth, that he just wasn't good enough. Hearing this drove the young artist to work harder. He bought Stella Mackey's portrait book, along with an assortment of hard pastels, and ferociously practiced until he was ready to reapply. He succeeded, marking the beginning of his career as an artist. Averaging 7 portraits a day, he naturally gained skills at painting a variety of people from life. To be completely equipped, he knew he needed an intensive academic course. When he received a catalog from the Art Students League of New York, the work of Robert Brackman sealed the academic approach that Daniel desired. Daniel headed to New York, got a job at an art materials store, and enrolled in Brackman's evening class at ASL. In his first class, Brackman came in, spotted Daniel's work, and remarked to the class, "We have a lot of talent this year." Drafted into the Army in 1957, Daniel served 2 years, was honorably discharged, and moved back to Greenwich Village. He continued sketching portraits, networking, and participating in art shows, and was proposed for membership at the Salmagundi Club. After he became a member, Daniel was asked to teach, and did so at the National Academy of Design and at the Art Students League. Later, in 1979 and 1980, Daniel taught summer-long classes in Gloucester, Massachusetts. Finding he enjoyed being away from New York City, he closed his 67th Street studio. Unbeknownst to Daniel, a pastel artist named Wende Caporale had gone to ASL in search of his teaching, after her own professors recommended that she study with Daniel. Although she discovered Daniel had recently left New York, she saw one of his portraits and experienced a life-changing, prophetic moment. Once discovering Daniel was now in North Salem, New York, Wende enrolled in his classes at what has become the well-known and loved Studio Hill Farm. At the time, neither Wende nor Daniel realized their lives would intertwine to become more than teacher and artist. Spending many summers painting and working together, their personal relationship blossomed, and they married in 1986. Wende was born in 1956 in the Bronx, New York, to Italian-American parents Edward and Vera. As a child, she loved to read and was quiet compared to her siblings. She engaged herself with art and a variety of crafts. She was inspired by the black and white illustrations she found in children's books and in an old series of Encyclopedia Britannica given to her by her father. Later in high school, Wende enjoyed all the available but few art classes. Although she was very interested in art, she did not pursue an art career after graduating. Instead, she chose to attend secretarial school in the hope of finding employment. Still, Wende's passion for art reigned supreme. Once Wende and Daniel were married, they continued their lives in the world of art and also raising their daughter Avignon. Daniel painted commissioned portraits, did non-commissioned work for galleries, and taught workshops all over the U.S. and at Studio Hill Farm. Wende worked as a freelance illustrator and segued into commissioned portraits, gravitating towards children's portraits. For many years, Wende has participated in the Pastel Society of Art exhibitions at the National Arts Club in New York City. Her work was often selected to be among the highlights of the exhibitions that later traveled to Youngstown, Ohio, and other regional museums. Wende's work has won numerous awards from the Pastel Society of America, Hudson Valley Art Association, Allied Artists of America, the Salmagundi Club, and Audubon Artists. Since 1999, Wende has participated in the Portrait Society of America as a faculty member, presenter, demonstrator, juror, and award recipient. In 2006, Wende joined the board of Artist Fellowship Incorporated, a 160-year-old 501c3 charitable organization that financially assists professional artists and their families in times of need. After serving for several years as vice president, she was elected president and served in that role for 5 years. As president emeritus, she has continued on the board in the capacity of chairman of the Relief Assistance Committee. Daniel's work has garnered many awards of achievement, including 44 prizes and a place in the Hall of Fame from the Pastel Society of America, a gold medal from the Portrait Society of America, a gold medal as a Salmagundi Club honoree, a place in the Hall of Fame for the Oil Painters of America, and many more. His works are in over 700 public and private collections in the United States and abroad, including the Butler Institute of American Art, the Cincinnati Art Museum, the Pentagon and House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian Institution, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as well as many others. Daniel has painted the portraits of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, Commander Astronaut Walter Sherrod Jr., Ayn Rand, Natalie Portman, Bob Schiffer, Bryant Gumbel, and numerous congressmen, governors, judges, educators, and industrialists. Daniel's books and instructional videos have reached people worldwide and have been translated into multiple languages. He has taught over 10,000 students during his 6 decades of teaching, and his influence continues. We want to recognize and celebrate Daniel and Wende's long-standing commitment and contribution to the arts, and thank them for their decades of teaching and inspiring hopeful and eager art students. It is our honor to present Daniel Greene and Wende Caporale with the Fine Art Connoisseur Lifetime Achievement Award.
All right.
Here. Great.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Right here. Yep. Okay, we're on either side of you.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Okay.
Oh,
Great. Okay. Just right over here.
fantastic.
So sit down right there. Take a load off.
Thank you.
There we go. What a thrill.
One more time. Let them see it. They were up down there.
Award.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Can you put this aside?
Absolutely. I'll hold it. Yes.
Thank
Yep.
you.
Yep. Let's do a photo here quickly.
Look right there.
Excellent.
Oh, now look right here. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks so much. We'll hold these.
We're going to hang on.
Wonderful. Don't take it back.
All right.
So,
So we're going to let you guys
Yes.
do your thing.
we're going to hear from Wende
You want to go
first.
first?
Well, first of all, I am totally overwhelmed. I'm in disbelief. Thank you to Peter Trippi and to Eric Rhodes. I said to Dan when he first heard from Peter that we were going to be honored, we, collectively, I said, "Are you sure?" And he said, "Yes." He said, Peter said, "Both of us." And I didn't believe him until we heard from Peter. I am humbled and honored to receive this award, to receive this recognition. I want to take you quickly through my trajectory as an artist. I'm going to show you some embarrassing early illustrations. I studied let me go back a little bit. I imagined being an artist when I was very young, and I really wanted to, but I lacked the resources and the support. When I started, I got a job as a secretary because I knew that I could support myself doing that, and I started taking art classes at night. It wasn't until I had a near-fatal automobile accident that I decided my life had to change course. I knew that I couldn't continue serving other people and not creating art. So I quit my job, and I moved to New Haven and went to Pear College of Art. I chose illustration in the hope of making a living as an artist. I figured this is a commercial art field, and I thought that would be a good thing for me to do. When I was in my second year at Pear, I had become interested in pastel, and two of my instructors, one an illustration instructor and the other a fine artist, encouraged me to seek out Dan's work. One of them had seen him demonstrate, and the other just knew him by reputation. In fact, I found his book in the library, and I was really captivated. So I went to the Art Students League to enroll in his class during a summer break, or winter break, excuse me. And I was told that he had just left, that he moved someplace upstate. So I was devastated. While I was there, I saw his portrait of Robert Beverly Hale hanging in the office at the Art Students League, and I was blown away. I'd never seen anything like it, and I thought, this is going to change my life. And it did. Fast forward, I signed up for his summer workshop, which I discovered was being taught in North Salem, New York. North Salem happened to be 10 minutes from my childhood home in Ridgefield, Connecticut. We live right on the border. We're still there. I moved there in 1982. We married in 1986. Yes, if you do the math, we lived in sin for a few years. I pursued illustration. I continued with illustration. It was really my interest and a field that I found really captivating, but I was being drawn more and more into portraiture. I attended Dan's classes during the summer. He used to give 10 weeks of classes when I first met him, and later, actually I should be showing you some images. This is some of my early work in illustration. I did a lot of work for Reader's Digest for their magazine, and this is what I was doing at that time in the early 80s. And what I loved so much about editorial work was that I would read the story and come up with the design, and the art director gave me a lot of freedom to do what I wanted to do, which was really great. The illustration business actually really tanked by the early 90s, and when I say tanked, was no longer requiring artists to use paint, and they really shifted towards computer-generated art, which is not something I wanted to do. So it was a natural progression for me to segue into portraiture, which is what really held my interest as time developed. So I'm kind of zipping through these. I did a lot of young adult novels, a lot of editorial work. I did have an agent who got me other work as, well, a lot of different types of illustration work, but the work I liked best was doing editorial work and involving children. So as I said, the illustration business changed in the early 90s. Dan and I had been married for a few years, and we had our daughter in 1991. And I found that, I'm kind of zipping ahead here. I met a lot of parents of children my daughter's age, and I started asking the parents if I could have their children pose for me. And that led to people commissioning me to paint their children's portraits. So that's how my portrait business began. I was doing all pastels at that time. So now we go to portraiture. And let's see. I connected to portrait agencies. This was a demonstration I had done at Pear College, where I went to school in New Haven. But I connected with portrait agencies, and I started getting work through the agencies. A lot in the Southeast, but a lot along the East Coast mostly. And I continued to help my husband with his business, with his portrait business. I painted in classes in the summer. And I traveled with him when he was teaching his workshops for many years. And I enjoyed the ebb and flow of the portraiture business, but ended up continuing to do my own work. When I didn't have commissions, I ended up spending more time working on my own work, which I really found to enjoy. By the early 2000s, I was looking for a meaningful way to give back. And I connected with a group called the Artists Fellowship. It was a group that honored my husband in the late 90s. And I had a good friend who was associated with it, my friend Babette Bloch, who was then the president. And I gained an understanding of their mission, which I'll tell you a little about. And Babette asked me if I wanted to join the board. And I had never done anything like this before, but I was so captivated by what this organization was doing. So it's a 160-year-old organization. They operate out of the Salmagundi Club in New York, And I say we because I've now been involved for 13 years, and I'll probably be involved for the rest of my life. It's such a wonderful organization. We give aid to artists. Artists in terms of professional artists who work within the United States, who are in a crisis. Now, the crisis could be a health crisis, it could be a natural disaster, or it could be any number of things. And I'm going to read a couple of thank you letters we've gotten from artists and give you a little background on what their situation was. We meet once a month at the Salmagundi Club to review cases. Our board is mostly artists. The majority of the board are artists. But we do have a social worker. We have a financial planner who's been on our board for almost 40 years and has grown our endowment since the early 80s, which was then at about $500,000 to $5.3 million. We give away, yeah, it's really quite incredible. We give away about $250,000 a year. And let's see, so I talked a little about the types of people who are on the board. They're mostly artists, but we do have a social worker, a financial professional, as I mentioned. We've also had the directors of the Art Students League, the New York Academy, who are no longer, sadly, on our board, but we do currently have the director of Studio Incaminati, who's actually here tonight, our friend, Dan Thompson. And we also had a curator from a prominent private art collection in New York City. The dues, now I'm going to give my pitch. The dues for an artist to join the Artist Fellowship is $40 a year. What we give back is pretty much a newsletter once a year. We invite you to our annual gala, which is held in New York City every year. This year, we just had it a couple of weeks ago, and we honored the Gottlieb Foundation, which actually does a similar kind of thing to what we're doing, but they haven't been around as long as we have. But we also honored, we honor an organization and we honor artists. And we honored Eric Fischel and his wife April Gornick this year, two very prominent New York artists. So getting back to the type of people we help with the fellowship. Illness, I mentioned. I'm citing a particular case where there was a young woman who was a cancer victim, who had gone through a series of treatments for cancer, chemo treatments and so forth, and nothing was working. So she wanted to seek out alternative treatments, and her insurance company wouldn't pay for it. So she came to us, and I don't know how she heard about us, but she came to us and asked if we would be willing to finance her treatments. And the board got together and quickly agreed. So we financed her treatments, and she is still healthy, and she's making art. 10 minutes, thank you. A few years ago, actually about a year into my presidency, Dan was reading the paper one morning, and there was an article about an artist who actually even held, it was a director of a gallery as well, a black artist, who had died, and his body was still in the morgue because his financial situation was in tatters, and his family was fighting over his estate, and his body was sitting in a morgue. They didn't have the money to bury him. So Dan said to me, this is exactly what the fellowship should do. I mean, this is the kind of thing that you could do. And actually, our fellowship, the fellowship, was started as a bereavement society, and it was meant to help artists whose families had lost loved ones, or the artist had died, or a member of their family had died. We provided the financial expense, the funeral expenses. So we reached out to the executors of this artist's estate, and found out he was literally in the morgue. They didn't know what he was going to do with it. They didn't know what was going to be done with his body. So we got together with the board, we discussed it, and the board agreed that we should contact them and find out what the funeral would cost. They came up with a number, we wrote out a check and sent it to them, and he was given a dignified funeral and burial. And his family was very, very grateful, even though, again, as I mentioned, they were fighting with one another, but it ended up as it should be. Let's see. We had an artist who approached us who had worked with who had been promised a show at a gallery and had prepared all the work, framed all the paintings, was all set to go. 2 months before the show was scheduled, he heard from the gallery that they were closing. So he was out all of this money and had invested almost a year of his time into this show. He had no money for his rent, his children's school expenses were coming due, and he contacted us, and we helped him get over that hurdle. I just want to read you, if you could bear with me for a moment, I want to read you a couple of the thank you letters we've gotten from artists. A 48-year-old artist, he works in painting and graphics in Indiana. He and his mother took care of his twin nieces after his sister abandoned them. One of the children developed leukemia. His mother then died, and he adopted these twin nieces. He requested $10,000 in aid to cover his mother's funeral expenses and his legal bills, and we gave him what he asked for. Let's see, and this is a letter from one of the recipients. To the Artist Fellowship, I can't thank you enough for your generous support. Your compassionate response has made such a difference in my life at this stressful time. Words cannot express my appreciation to you. And then another. Dear Relief and Assistance, yesterday I got another collection of bills from the doctor's office. They seemed to come in waves, and I spent most of the day anxiously mulling over who else can I borrow from, to cover them. So I was bowled over this afternoon when I got your letter and the check. This is going to make a huge difference to me, and I just cannot thank you enough. My very best to you. Okay, so with that, I'm hoping that you'll look in your packets that you've gotten, and there is a little brochure for the Artist Fellowship. You could look us up online, artistfellowship.org, and please consider becoming a member. It's $40 a year for artists, it's $60 for sustaining members, and $275 for corporate members. Hint, hint, Peter. Let's see. And I just want to emphasize one thing. We help artists during crises. It could be any type of crisis, as I hope I spelled out to you. But we do not give grants. We don't give grants for projects. A crisis could be you're behind several months on rent, I want to add. If you're facing eviction, you've worked steadily as an artist, and all of a sudden you find that you haven't been able to pay the rent for several months. That would qualify. Again, a heartfelt thank you to Peter and to Eric. I'm really overwhelmed. If I have played some small role in advancing the cause of realist figurative art, I'm humbled by your recognition. I sincerely hope all of you carry the torch of this tradition forward with your wonderful work, your wonderful and imaginative work. You're a great group of artists, very, very impressive. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You have been fantastic. Yep.
Yeah.
Great. There's the brochure
Yes.
right there. I'll leave that with you.
Yes, thank you.
So now we'll hear from Dan.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I want to say thank you to Eric and to Peter for selecting Wende and me to be the recipients of this marvelous honor. I also want to thank all of you who have come here and have agreed that this is an event that may be very meaningful to you, and I want to convey my thanks for the great honor that you are bestowing upon the two of us. Now, in my own case, I know that you've probably run out of people to give honors to. I've lasted all the way to 85 years old and have painted, thank you. I've been painting for 7 decades. And during that time, I have met with a lot of successes. And I wanted to convey, for those of you that may be interested, some of the things that I think are important to acquire as skills in order that you can put your best foot forward and succeed in your own right in the activities that include painting and improving.
Your scarf. Believe it or not, your scarf is rubbing
Oh,
the microphone.
fine.
As-
Let's do that.
As elegant as that scarf is,
Thank you.
we're going to take it away so that folks can hear you, okay?
Perfectly okay. Thank you very much. Now that I'm scarfless, I'll have to try to think of what other things I may be able to add. One of the things that I mentioned to Eric is that I had a relationship of painting a number of portraits of the famous author Ayn Rand when I was quite young. And as a result of my interaction with Ayn and doing numbers of portraits of her and having hours upon hours upon hours of debates and discussions, I formulated a few things that I think will be helpful perhaps to some of you in all of your activities with portrait sitters in particular. And if there is one thing that I want to convey today, it is how one can conduct themselves successfully when painting portraits. I know many of you are involved with painting portraits. And that is, do not solicit approval. That is the key phrase that I want to convey. Do not solicit approval, which means don't act as though it is extremely important to you that your sitter likes what you are doing. Because if they pick up on that, they will surely tell you exactly how to paint so that you will please them. And I learned that from Ayn Rand. If you've ever had, from your own personal experiences, any situation where you encountered some problem and you told a friend about it, your friend will invariably have told you how to live your life so that you no longer have these problems. So my point of all this is, if you do not solicit approval, if you do not convey that it's very important to you what your client or your sitter thinks, very few people are going to take the liberty of telling you how to paint or telling you how to live your life. Now, that was a big lesson for me that I have employed in all of my dealings with clients over the years. But I have been asked to convey some of the things that I think one ought to do in order to best prepare themselves to be as skillful an artist as you can be. And I have a list of what those things are. Let's see. Well, first and foremost is to study the whole history of art, to become familiar with every phase of art that goes all the way back to Egyptian art and to Gothic art and to the Renaissance painters, to painters since the Renaissance, to modern works, so that you can develop taste as to what kind of techniques, what kind of skills these great artists all had in common. And one of the things that it seems to me they all had in common was that they had a knowledge of fundamental painting skills, drawing. You have to teach yourself how to draw as well as you possibly can. That's an important ingredient in becoming very skillful. You have to become skillful in being able to judge values. Values are the light and dark quality of colors. And so when one looks at color, you can see it two ways. You can see it as color, and you can see it as its relationship to black, gray, and white.
that becomes second nature after a while, but it requires an absolute concern with becoming very skillful at values. That's an essential quality. I would recommend that each of you becomes very skillful in all these fundamentals, and then the effort in becoming an artist is to try, in my opinion, to interpret them in personal ways. So, to begin with, if you are very well versed in all of the fundamental skills of painting, you can then pick and choose the methods that you will employ in given pictures, and you can pick and choose what you will say as a result of having command of all these fundamental skills. The self-serving achievements that I've garnished over 6 decades of painting are as a result of attaining a manipulation of painting skills with the further quality of making a personal vision. I believe that having something unique to present is the ultimate goal of being an artist. Based on this assumption, a varied mastery of painting techniques is essential. What I'm going to do now is, if this is all workable, try to show you some of the paintings that I've done over the last 70 years let's see. Well, this is saying, oh, this is one of the first pictures that I did when I moved to Miami Beach, and this was a Cuban artist that I worked with who was in one of these storefront portraiture galleries. I knew nothing at all when I did this portrait of him, but that's an example of what I did before I had any training, any study, any experience. This is still another portrait that I did in Miami Beach. This was of a friend of mine who worked in the portrait studio on a very busy street in Miami Beach. His name was George. Then with George in 1954, I drove to New York to go to the Art Students League. In the meantime, well, here's a self-portrait that I did at age 19. I was beginning to pick up a little bit of knowledge from watching other artists work. This is a portrait of my teacher, Robert Brackman. It's a self-portrait. I received a catalog from the Art Students League that showed the work of Robert Brackman. And I said to myself that this work was marvelous and that I wanted to learn to paint like that. As a matter of fact, every time I see something about Robert Brackman, my eyes tear up. He was extremely generous to me, and I learned a great deal about painting from Robert Brackman. He recognized when I joined his class, well, here's another portrait of Robert Brackman's. This is one he did of Charles Lindbergh after Lindbergh had flown the Atlantic, and it was instrumental in Brackman becoming famous. This was a portrait that I did in Brackman's class. It was a pastel, and I was just beginning to learn some of the fundamental ingredients that Brackman was teaching. This is a young boy that, as I look at it, shows me that I was picking up some of the ingredients that I was learning in Brackman's class: values, modeling, color, drawing. This was still another that I did in Brackman's class. I was very successful with this portrait. I exhibited it at the National Academy, which was an extremely competitive art show, and I got in and won a prize, and that was very meaningful. This is a nude that I did in Brackman's class. I don't know if you can see it, but there are lines being pulled down from the head to the body, and that was my first instance of using plumb lines. And I still use plumb lines. If any of you don't use plumb lines, they can be marvelously helpful, where something that is above may relate to something that is below, and all you have to do is hold a straight line up to it, and it can give you very accurate readings of what you're doing. This was a picture I did in Brackman's class of a wonderful model called Saul, and it was particularly meaningful to me because Saul didn't move a muscle when he posed. I had figured out by dividing my canvas in half where I should put the middle of Saul so that I would get the proper composition on the left and the proper composition on the right. It was also very meaningful to me as a painting because I kept changing my mind every day about what colors I saw on Saul. And this was an instrumental painting in my learning how to see color, which was greatly a question of practice and working from life. And if you have a model as patient as Saul, so much the better. This was a portrait that one of the teachers at the Art Students League, Sidney Dickinson, painted of me when I was a student at the Art Students League. I guess I was about 19 at the time. Then I went into the Army, and this is a portrait that I did in 1959 when I was in the Army. Then I I got out of the Army in 1959. I moved to Greenwich Village. And in Greenwich Village, I met a number of abstract artists. And I started to frequent some of the watering holes that these fledgling abstract artists went to. This was a time when there were many, many abstract painters congregating in Greenwich Village, and I met a number of them. And at first it seemed to me, well, maybe I should become an abstract artist. And so I tried to do abstract paintings, and I discovered it was too easy. And I say that humbly. There just wasn't any challenge to it. It wasn't difficult to make abstract paintings. And so I became very suspect of going in that direction. It seems I wasn't going to be able to learn anything. I decided instead to focus on trying to become a very skillful classical artist. And I knew that if I gained classical painting skills, that I could go in whatever direction I wanted, and that one really couldn't learn everything there was in classical painting, because classical painting had been employed by all of the great artists of the past, that was a more solid foundation. This, however, was in my expressionistic field. I don't know what this painting means. I don't know what it came from, but at one point I was working in this expressionistic style, and I just kind of made this picture up. I was very involved in playing pool when I was in high school. I had what might be called a misspent youth. And as a result, I did a few paintings of pool players and pool rooms. And this again was in that expressionistic style. There is a self-portrait in it. The man shooting the pool stick, in between his pool stick and his arm, there is a head, and that head is me. At any rate, that was a pool room scene, another expressionistic picture. I got out of the Army and I moved to Greenwich Village. In order to earn some money, I started doing portraits on the street. And this is a photograph of me was taken while doing a portrait, pastel portrait near Washington Square. This is a self-portrait in 1960. This is an old man whom I befriended, and he agreed to pose for me. And I began experimenting with oil paint and underpainting and glazing and modeling and drawing. And it was a significant painting because it was in the direction of the classical kind of painting that I wanted to pursue. I went out on the street in my neighborhood and I began painting the buildings that were nearby. This was just simply called Yellow Building. This was about a block away from where I lived in Greenwich Village. I lived on McDougal Street. The next street over had the back of a tavern that was called the Commons. And I went out early in the morning and painted the rear view of the Commons. While I was painting, some feral cats came out to watch me. And so I decided to put them in the picture. And let's see. Nothing's happening there.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, this is a view from my window on McDougal Street. And I started this painting, but it looked to me too much like an Edward Hopper. And so I stopped painting it. Because at that time, it was important to me that whatever I was painting at least be my own. I didn't want to be influenced by anyone. Even if the work was bad, I wanted it to be my own. And this one was on the road to being bad, so I discontinued it.
True.
This was a friend of mine, a sketch artist named Otto. I painted him in a cafe. I can't remember the name of the cafe. It was a famous coffee shop in Greenwich Village. And Otto was a sketch artist. This was a momentous picture for me because I painted a model that I'd met at the Art Students League, and I didn't have the robe on him. It was just a head and a bit of the body. And halfway through the picture, I had what for me was the first time the feeling of inspiration. And all of a sudden, I decided to put this white monk's outfit on him and the rapid background. I don't remember doing it. I only remember the wonderful sensation of feeling that I had been self-inspired. And so that's a quality that I rate very highly when you are fully equipped and you suddenly feel you're inspired. This was the same model who posed for me many times, and I painted him as a monk. This is an oil painting. I applied to the Green Shields Foundation grant in Montreal, Canada, and I sent them a photograph, or maybe I sent the painting, I don't remember which, but I sent them an image of this painting and requested a certain amount that I figured out I could live on if I got the grant. I think it was something at that time like maybe $6,000, and I figured if I was frugal, I could make that money last for a year. Well, to my astonishment, I got a reply from them, a check for $6,000. So I won a grant, which for the first time enabled me to be able to paint full-time by simply watching my money. This is a self-portrait that I did at the same time. I was fortunate enough to do a portrait of Eleanor Roosevelt. My sister was going to Brandeis University, and Mrs. Roosevelt came frequently to lecture at Brandeis University. So I used one of those occasions to do a very rapid pastel, simply because I was an admirer of Mrs. Roosevelt. Mrs. Roosevelt became a good friend of my sister's and got my sister a job with the State Department, which we all knew to be the CIA at that time. But at any rate, Eleanor Roosevelt figured prominently in our lives. I eventually had an opportunity to present to First Lady Hillary Clinton one of two portraits that I did of Mrs. Roosevelt. And Mrs. Clinton took the portrait, and it is now being displayed at the Clinton Presidential Library in Arkansas. It also gave my wife and me an opportunity to meet and talk with Mrs. Clinton, an opportunity to see President Clinton from afar when he was at work as president. This was one of the most significant people that I've ever met. I've already mentioned something to you about Ayn Rand. For those of you that are not familiar with her work, she wrote the book The Fountainhead about an idealistic architect. She wrote Atlas Shrugged, which was about the very skillful people in corporate America who decided to go on strike. I had numerous dealings with Ayn Rand over a period of a number of years. I was a proponent of her philosophy, the part of it particularly which struck a chord with me, which was to do the very best you possibly can and not compromise. And she related to that greatly. This was a pose that I selected, which was the second pose that I selected for a portrait that I did of her. I chose a pose where her head was turned in one direction, the body was turned in another, and she objected to the pose. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to impart a feeling of action or movement to the arrested action that my head turned in one direction, the body turned in another presented. She felt, however, that she should be facing the viewer squarely, just as she felt she should be facing life squarely, or in a frontal position. So this was the second portrait that I did of her. I think this portrait, or maybe it's another that I did of her, is on the cover of one of her books called For the New Intellectual.
This one.
But I formulated, as did she, feelings about art during our many sessions together. She would come to my house at night and we would debate various points of art, or I would go to her house and she would have an art aesthetician there taking notes, and we would discuss art. And I know that she formulated some of her ideas because at the time even though I was very young, I was rather articulate about what I felt about art, and she was completely brilliant, so it made for very informative sessions. This is a portrait I did in my studio of one of the astronauts, Commander Walter Schirra, who eventually was a commander on one of the flights to the moon. And it was a thrill meeting him. He was extremely skillful as an architect. And I was very happy to have had the opportunity of painting his picture. The portrait is now somewhere in the Smithsonian Institution. There's I don't remember what it's called. There's a museum there that's devoted to the astronauts and to aircraft. Do you remember the name?
National Air and Space Museum.
Air and
say
Space.
again?
Air and Space Museum.
Right, exactly.
Oh, good. Thank you very much. Yeah, Air and Space Museum. It just came to me.
In the form of Peter.
This is Commander Schirra. If you can imagine for the moment getting in that object on the top and then being thrust into space by a rocket, that takes some courage. In this picture, however, I made a big mistake. I painted his medals, but I didn't put them in perspective. They're facing frontal, and they should have been in perspective. Well, I never made that mistake again, but there it is, and I guess it'll always be in that portrait. This was a pastel I did of 3 friends of mine in Greenwich Village, and later I exhibited this picture in an exhibition at the National Arts Club, and I received a letter from a famous artist, John Johansson, who had painted a portrait of Frick, Henry Clay Frick, which hangs over the mantelpiece at the Frick Museum. And John Johansson said to me that he thought the head on the right of the Harlequin was the best head he had seen in the last 10 years. And would I allow him to come and visit me? I was thrilled to receive him, and he came to my studio, and he became a kind of mentor to me. He was a member of the National Academy of Design. He was a member of the National Arts Club. He had a beautiful studio at the National Arts Club, and he proposed me to the National Arts Club and to the National Academy. He also asked me to come and visit him at the National Arts Club in his studio, and while there, he counseled me on giving the benefit of the best lighting and pose to your model rather than to the painting you were working on. He also introduced me to a contemporary competitor of mine, Everett Raymond Kinsler. And Kinsler and I became very friendly and became friendly competitors over the last 70 years. And we became, in effect, John Johansson's proteges. He was very helpful to both of us. He gave us instruction, he gave us advice. So that was a momentous occurrence. This is a pool room scene that I did. I told you that I was interested in pool rooms. Notice that the pool table is in perspective. It all goes to a vanishing point because I learned that lesson. Then I moved to a studio, a beautiful studio on West 67th Street. That's me at 29. This is my studio. This is part of my studio. This came available. It had 22-foot ceilings. It had a 20-foot north light window. It had 7 rooms. It was a beautiful place, and I knew that nothing like this would ever come available again, and so I extended myself and I rented it, and I decided that I would teach more classes in order to help pay for it, and it was a very wise move because I loved the studio and it was very instrumental. Let's see, this is just another pastel. I'm going to stop showing these and save time. If anyone has any questions, I have time to try to formulate an answer. Anybody have any question? I'm sorry, what?
What was the rent on the studio?
At the time, it was $400 a month. The studio eventually went co-op. I had a collector who gave me dated checks, and I was able to buy it. The studio today is worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $70 million, $80 million. No?
No.
Very expensive. I can't afford it, but I loved having it. Any other questions? Yes.
Is the mic?
When I can't hear the
I'm
question.
sorry,
The
What is
question
it?
has to do with the book that you produced at the beginning of your career,
Oh,
Your pamphlet book, your book that,
A pamphlet book.
oh, yes.
Art of Pastel?
I
Art of
was
Pastel?
asked to do a book, a kind of like a Foster book, of 4 or 5 pages, a long time ago, and I agreed to do it, and it was called The Art of Pastel, and I guess it's still on the internet. I decided instead of taking royalties on it, that I would take one lump sum, which was a mistake because the book was eventually translated into about 7 or 8 languages. And I would have probably made some money if I had done it the other way. Say again?
She just bought it for $200.
Oh,
You're
my God.
kidding.
Oh, my God.
Well, that's more than I was paid to do it. Say again?
Okay, the question, that was then.
how would you critique it?
How would you critique
Oh.
that book now?
Well, I've had a lot more experience personally in working in pastel. I've had an immense amount of experience since then. And I would probably have included more surfaces upon which one could work. I think I only had 1 or 2 surfaces in the book. But I don't think there's anything in it that would be any different today other than I've learned more in the interim. And had it been a larger book, I might have included more, but there would definitely have been more about surfaces for pastel. I would hold on to that. You got a gold mine.
The first pastel she copied as an
Oh,
artist.
good. Well,
That's very nice.
I
Yeah.
think that's
you.
an excellent choice.
Here, in the center, a question. Ms.
Yeah.
Rand told you that she wanted to look forward, straight ahead,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
This questioner says that she likes that when the sitter is looking straight forward.
Okay.
And in terms of that dialogue between the artist and the sitter, so you would have appreciated that instruction, is that correct? How do you feel about the full frontal look now? When you think about your own portraits being made today, would you want that for your sitters to look straight ahead?
I practically never do a full frontal portrait now because I am a believer in trying to impart some feeling of action, movement, arrested movement to the painting. And one does that by having opposite thrusts, different directions. And so compositionally, a full frontal view doesn't quite give me enough to work with. I prefer to have a feeling of arrested action and composition. You're welcome.
Okay, one more question. Yes, right there.
Can you talk more about how you put emotion in your work?
Say again?
How do you put emotion in your work? Can
Motion.
you talk about that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I am of the belief that artists are particularly sensitive to
I'm going to advance these.
other people, to moods, to attitudes, to gestures. And so I feel that it's incumbent upon an artist to register what someone that they're painting conveys to the artist and to try to interpret those emotions by selecting the right pose, the right lighting, the right gestures, the right attitude. But again, it all comes down to a feeling of empathy. I believe that as portrait artists particularly, you're gifted with an insight into the sensitivity to impart an emotional feeling about the person that you're painting into the portrait. How one does that, I think, is largely an individual kind of thing.
Okay, so thank you, Dan and Wende. I want to thank you again for your incredibly eloquent comments. Bravo.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.